it's Miss Seward. Today we're going to be doing section 2.5, which is about natural disruptions to ecosystems. The learning objective for today is that you can explain how natural disruptions, both short and long-term, impact an ecosystem. You're going to get a chance to practice the skill of data analysis, where you describe patterns or trends in data. And from these notes, you're going to gain knowledge on natural disruptions, what causes them, some of the time scales that we see them change over time, and just kind of what can happen from these disruptions to wildlife and ecosystems. Now, a natural disturbance is going to be a natural event that disrupts the structure and or function of an ecosystem. So the main part here is it's a natural event. So it is not human caused. Some examples of these could be like tornadoes, hurricanes, asteroids, like the one that took out the dinosaurs, forest fires, droughts, things like that. And natural disturbances can actually have the ability to be greater than human disruptions. So if we think about the example that I just mentioned with the asteroid that took out the dinosaurs, along with millions of other species, that one is going to have a much greater disruption than any human disruption that has happened thus far. So they can be pretty extreme, not all the time, but they do have the power to be like very impactful. Now, when we are talking about disruptions, there's three different time scales that we can quantify them on. And this is going to be periodic, episodic, or just random time frames. So periodic is going to be something that occurs with regular frequency. This could be something like dry and wet seasons that just happen throughout an ecosystem. Like if you think out on the savanna in Africa, how they're going to get dry seasons, they're going to get wet seasons. This happens in a very periodic time that we are able to predict. It's consistent. So it's going to be something that is periodic. It happens frequently. The next type is going to be episodic, which is where it's going to be occasional events with irregular frequency. Now, this might be something like hurricanes that we might see happening in Florida, droughts, or fires, like the wildfires that we see here in Washington or in California. They're going to be happening somewhat frequently, but irregular. It's not like a very predictable pattern. And we are not always able to just like predict when they are going to happen until it's like kind of in the process of happening. Now, the last type that we have is random. There is no regular frequency. We might be able to understand what's going on, but we can't like predict it in advance. So this might be things like volcanoes or earthquakes or something like an asteroid. They're very random. Now, we do have this idea of natural climate change, and Earth's climate has varied over geologic time for numerous reasons. And this is a natural change that just happens over time. Like if you've heard about the ice ages, those were just natural climate changes. And this can happen, for example, from things like the slight changes in Earth's orbital, like the orbit around the sun, and then also tilts. This can cause many ice ages and warmer periods. So if we look at this diagram here, you can see that because the Earth orbits, not in like a perfect circle, but it's in an oval, you're going to have certain times where you actually get a little bit closer to the sun. And then the tilt of the Earth also just ever so slightly shifts so that you're going to potentially get changes. We're talking like tens of thousands of years. So like the tilt might be enough every like 41,000 years to be changed. Or we might see over like 100,000 to 400,000 years is when we're going to get the slight shift in Earth's orbit that's going to cause it to like have warmer periods. Now, if we look at a time scale over hundreds of thousands of years, you can see that we do have natural fluctuations in our temperature. So the red line here is representing temperature. And over time, you can see there's periods where we have generally warmer temperatures, which are going to be warmer periods, colder ones, which are going to coincide with more like ice age type times. And then we also have carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is tied to temperature of the planet. If you think about like global warming because of increased carbon dioxide, or when the temperatures warm up, the oceans actually will release more carbon dioxide. They can't hold as much, and so you get even more. So these are correlated. And over time, we're seeing that periods where it's warmer are coinciding with periods where we have higher amounts of carbon dioxide, and this fluctuates over time. So it's important to be aware that we do have like natural climate cycles over time. In this class, we tend to focus a lot on conversations about current climate changes that are related to human impact, but that it's important to be aware that there are natural climate changes that occur over time. However, what we are seeing here, if you look over time at the amount of carbon dioxide, then we look at what's going on currently. And we are seeing carbon dioxide levels that are so extremely over what we have ever seen in the past, like hundreds of thousands of years. So obviously, this is why scientists are rightfully very concerned about the amount of carbon dioxide that we have and how humans are tied to that. So even though we do have natural climate change, I don't want this to take away in importance from the human impacts that are affecting the amount of carbon dioxide. But natural climate cycling is a thing that has caused changes in Earth's temperature and climate over time. Now, because of these changes in temperature, our sea level has varied over our geological time as glacial ice on Earth melts and forms. So if we look again at historical data from the past few 100,000 years, you're going to notice that in times where we have peaks of carbon dioxide, these are also going to be times where sea levels are going to be rising. So if you look at those corresponding peaks and we see sea levels going up, the change in carbon dioxide and the change in having these temperature fluctuations does also impact the sea levels on Earth, because higher temperatures means more ice melting, which means increased sea levels. So these natural climate changes end up having impacts on things like sea level. Now, environmental changes end up resulting in habitat disruption. So when you have major environmental disturbances, this results in widespread habitat changes and or loss. So an example that we could look at when we were just mentioning rising sea levels, we can then zoom in and see how these rising sea levels will impact coastal and estuary habitats. So if we were to look at this picture here, if we've got like normal levels of the sea, you have these salts, marsh, and mangroves, which if you remember when we talked about aquatic biomes, these are really important areas with a lot of species living there. They tend to be nurseries for marine organisms, and you have a lot of biodiversity in these type of ecosystems. Now, if we have the sea level rising, what this is going to do is it's going to push the marsh and mangrove habitats to have to go to higher levels so that they aren't underwater. And this can shift the place where they're going to be. And sometimes where they're moving up to, there isn't a place for them to shift into. So it can result in habitat loss. But either way, the organisms who are in here are going to have to adapt and move with it, or they're going to die off and have to have new ones come in later once it's moved. So these sea levels are going to actually like change these habitats and change the life for the organisms in them. And another way that you can go and zoom in and look at this is going to be when you think about like the amount of sunlight that can get to organisms. If we've normally got these plants that get a bit of sunlight, and then up here, these ones who are kind of the salt marshes where they're pretty close to the surface, so they are getting the sun that they need. If the sea level rises, these plants who need to be really close to the sun and getting like out of the water, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to get the sunlight they need. They're not going to be able to get up out of the water like they need. So they are going to die off, which again is going to mean that this is going to be pushing where these plants are going to need to be moving in order to survive, because down here, they're not going to be able to survive anymore. They do not get the sunlight that they need. So what this can lead to is when there is new habitat or disruptions to habitats, wildlife may migrate to a new habitat as the result of natural disruptions. So an example might be wildebeest migrating to follow rain patterns of the African savanna. So if you look at an example here, throughout the year, the wildebeests move to different areas based on the rain patterns, as the rain patterns kind of move throughout the year, where you've got August to October. They're going to be farther up, like across the border into Kenya, and then they're going to move down farther south to Tanzania, kind of following some of the like rivers and lakes and rain patterns in order to make sure that they are having the water that they need to survive. Another example can be ocean species moving further north as water temperatures warm. And a third example can be bird migration and breeding shifting earlier as insect hatching shifts earlier with the warming climate. So if we look at this diagram here, in the past, when you are having these birds laying their eggs, the date of their hatching is kind of around like end of May, that is when their babies are going to be hatchling. Now this corresponds with caterpillar hatching as well, because caterpillars are going to be a main food source for these birds and their babies. So previously, the caterpillars are hatching also at the end of May. So it lines up with the point where these birds are going to need the most amount of food to feed their babies, is when they're going to have the most amount of food available for from the caterpillars here. Now, about a few decades later, when we have this mismatch from today. Now, because of our warming climate, you are going to have shifts in some of the hatchings of organisms where their hatch is tied to temperature. So, for example, caterpillars are now going to be hatching and having the most amount of baby caterpillars around like May 15th. However, these birds are still laying their eggs at the same time. They are starting to have like hatching at this point. So when they're actually having like growing babies that are getting bigger, when they need the most food, that is going to be at the tail end of these caterpillar, which means there's way less food, which means babies can die because they're starving because their parents can't get enough food. And so in order for them to shift, they are going to have to change their migration. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because if you think of the fact that migration is tied to like avoiding areas with snow or making sure that they are in areas where they have food, there's kind of a lot into it. So it's not just as simple as like, oh, birds just leave earlier. And so it's a complex evolutionary process that gets them to this migration. And so right now, if they are not having the food that they need, then that is going to impact their migration, and their breeding is going to have to shift in order for them to survive. So your practice FRQ for today is doing data analysis, where you're going to describe patterns or trends in data. So if you look at this diagram here, this diagram is showing the first leaf date in honeysuckle, a type of plant. And so if you're looking, these like yellow to orangish colors are going to be the first leaf date is happening earlier than historical data, how it used to. And the blue ones are going to be where it is happening later than it historically used to. So what you're going to do is look at this diagram and describe the relationship between latitude and change in first leaf date depicted in the graph. Explain why you think this relationship exists. So that will be your practice FRQ. And this was your section 2.5 notes. And I hope that you learned something from it.